All right. So last week, my understanding is Eric went through some of the promises that God was giving in Hebrews 11, and so he was kind of working his way through there. So we're gonna start by going off where we kind of left off before that. So we're in Hebrews chapter 11, and we're gonna start at verse 20. Um, and I just want to give you a heads up that I was asked 2 weeks ago to teach the youth at Tracy on Hebrews chapter 11, verse 21. So I went pretty down in depth in verse 21. So I have a lot of stuff there. So I'm not even sure we're actually going to get through two verses today, but I'm hoping we do. And if I'm going too slow, feel free to yell at me or something, and I'll try to speed up. Whoa, there was like a polar bear that was popping up over Bill there a second ago. That was interesting. Okay, watch out for that polar bear, Bill. It looks like you already shot him though, so it's all good.
With the
All
camera,
right,
not a gun.
that's right. That's right. Okay, so let's go back. So we're going to be in Hebrews. We're in 11. We're going to start in verse 20, and again, we're looking at the faith of all of these people that the author of Hebrews has been talking about, and he's been giving us some good lessons on what faith is and how we can strengthen our faith and some other areas around that. So we're going to start with verse 20. Let's see. Tim, would you mind reading chapter 11, verse 20? One whole verse.
One whole verse. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future.
All right. So the first one that we're going to look at here is Isaac. And honestly, there's not a whole lot about Isaac in the Old Testament, right? There's some stuff that happens there. But even so, there's like a big chunk of his life is just missing from there. And so there's not a ton of great examples from Isaac of faith. What's interesting is what the author here picks up is when he blesses Jacob and Esau, which I think that in itself is interesting. So let's take a look at that. So this is in Genesis chapter 27. So if you guys want to move to Genesis chapter 27, let's see. We're not going to spend a ton of time over here. We're going to start in verse 26. We're not going to spend a ton of time looking at this promise or this blessing that he does, partially because we're going to spend some more time talking about similar things in the next verse, and also partially because I'm pretty sure Eric went over some of these concepts and these ideas last week because he was talking about these promises. Um, but there is still some interesting things here. So Genesis chapter 27. Let's see. John, I'm feeling like some King James. You have for reading verse 26 through 29?
Oh, absolutely.
He's got me on.
Sorry about that. So 26,
Through 29.
27, 26 through 29. Sorry about that. And his father Isaac said unto him, Come near now and kiss me, my son. And he came near and kissed him. And he smelled the smell of his raiment and blessed him and said, See, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field which the Lord hath blessed. Therefore God give thee of the dew of heaven and the fatness of the earth and plenty of corn and wine. Let people serve thee and nations bow down to thee. Be Lord over thy brethren, and let thy mother's sons bow down to thee. Cursed be every one that curseth thee, and blessed be he that blesseth thee.
All right. So we have this blessing that Isaac gives his son. And just for a little bit of context, because I don't know what the deal is with Isaac and Jacob, but they both love drama. And so just a little bit of there's just some crazy drama that's going on here, which is Isaac has a favorite son, which is probably not the smartest thing to do, but his favorite son is Esau. and he's blind, and so he wants to bless Esau. And of course, Jacob is scheming things and works with his mom, and he goes in and he gets the blessing. And so Isaac thinks he's blessing Esau, but he's actually blessing Jacob. So he gives Jacob this blessing. If we were to continue reading, and we're not going to do that, but if we were to continue reading, we would see that Esau comes in here and asks for the blessing, and Isaac's like, "What? I thought I already blessed you," and so Esau's, "Well, give me the blessing anyway." And Jacob's like, or Isaac is, "Sorry, I already gave that blessing away. Here, I'll bless you with something else," which turned out to be kind of a weird blessing, which is like, "You'll be the servants of your brother," and some things like that. So I don't know exactly how that was a blessing, but he gives him this one anyways. But it's slightly different because he already gave the blessing to Jacob. And so when we look at this passage here from Isaac giving this blessing to Jacob, what do you guys think is the act of faith that he's doing here?
Ooh, Isaac or Jacob?
Isaac, we're talking about Isaac right now.
Okay.
There's an act of faith that Isaac is doing, because that's what the author of Hebrews says, right? He's saying in Hebrews, he says, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau. So where's this faith happening? What do you guys see as this picture of faith that Isaac is showing us here?
Well, I'm just that if for him to actually do it, he's gonna have to feel that his blessing has some kind of credence, right? Or else he's just saying some words over some guys. Or
Yes.
So for him to go out and bless him, he's obviously feeling that he's got, I don't want to say power, but some kind of connection from God and being able to impart that onto his kids.
Okay. And I'll be on. Somebody was going to say something. I feel like
Sorry, John. Sorry.
Go ahead, Charlie.
No, I was just going to say the other part of this kind of clue it's given us that Isaac is blind. So there's faith that he is actually giving the blessing to his son. In this case,
Okay.
turned out it wasn't the correct one. So he had to do it all by sense and smell. So
Yeah.
The faith aspect, I don't know, I look at it that way.
Yeah, no, this is all good. This is interesting.
I think the faith portion is actually later, not at this moment.
Okay, what is the faith portion then? What do you think happens later?
If you go to Genesis 28,
Okay.
I don't know if you're gonna go there later, John, but
I wasn't. No, go ahead.
okay, Genesis 28, verse 3-4. And this is after all this. Obviously, it's hard to reconcile that he was blessing by faith at that moment in Genesis 27, because he didn't even know who he was blessing. So he was blind. He insisted in his own will, which actually was to bless Esau this way, not Jacob. So it's really hard to say that's the part he was exercising any kind of faith, because he should have also known, that blessing was never meant for Esau anyway, according to Rebecca, who received that, the older shall serve the younger blessing a while ago. But I think the faith portion is actually when Jacob is sent in Genesis 28. We can read 1-4. Isaac called Jacob and blessed him. There it is. Charged him and said to him, "You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's, and take yourself a wife from there of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother." And I think this is where probably verse 3 and 4 comes in. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiple. Now he's actually blessing Jacob the way it was always intended to be, that you may be an assembly of peoples. And I think verse 4 is the key, and give you the blessing of Abraham to you and your descendants with you, that you may inherit the land in which you are a stranger, which God gave to Abraham. So I think that's probably, if I were to think about it, that sounds like more of an act of faith than the previous chapter. Even though, because it doesn't, Hebrews 11 doesn't necessarily say Genesis 27 is the time.
That's true.
We're just jumping there because that's the actual blessing that was done, but clearly the circumstances were less than ideal in every way.
Yeah. No, I agree. This is something that's struggling, right? Because you're like, where is the faith aspect of it? And I think either way you take it, really what it comes down to for the faith of Isaac, is that he was given this promise through Abraham, right? God gave this promise to Abraham. It was passed down to him, and now he's passing that promise down to one of his sons, and he's passing it down to Jacob. And that is this promise that God's going to make them a great nation and that they're going to have the land of Canaan. So there's this faith is that God's given him a promise and he's passing down that promise, and he still has this belief that the promise is going to happen. And I think that's where this act of faith is. He still believes that God is going to fulfill his promise, even though he's handing it off to his sons. And the funny part is his intention was to hand it off to Esau, but it turns out God had other plans, and he ends up handing it off to Jacob. And Jacob is going to be the father of this nation. Which I think is funny, and that happens in that previous one that we read. But I'm with you, Rich. I think the act of faith here is the passing down of that promise. Just that he has this promise, he believes it's a real thing that he has, and he's passed it down.
Can I ask a question of the group, if anybody knows? It's always bothered me that the mom helped, deceive Isaac. And is there any reasoning for this? Do you guys know of, or is that just like, hey, I like you more. Your dad obviously liked the other son. Well, you're my favorite, so I want you to get it.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if you were to ask me, I think it's just there's just a whole lot of drama and scheming in that family. And we even see this in Jacob, and we're gonna get to there in a minute. He is a major schemer. He's like constantly trying to work an angle to do things. And I think that's just the way that family was. And
Belts, huh?
I have an interjection. Didn't it also say though that like Esau was more like a hunter and like a manly man, and Jacob
Yeah.
was more like a mama's boy, like
Oh
stand
yeah.
cook. So he kind of gravitated more towards his mother. So she probably was a little more partial to Jacob than Esau because he had his favor of his father because he's kind of more like his father.
You are absolutely correct. Rebecca definitely favors Jacob, and Isaac definitely favors Esau, which in itself, that's just some more drama, right? I mean, they're just going to cause problems by doing that, and they do cause problems by doing that. And Jacob has to live with the consequences of this struggle that the family put between Jacob and Esau for a long time. But you're absolutely right.
Well, also, I want you to look at Genesis 25. And it says
Right.
in verse 23, it says, and the Lord said to her, which is Rebekah, two nations are in your womb, and the two people will be separated from your body, and one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So this is the Lord telling Rebekah, here's the way it's supposed to be. And I think that's why she stepped in and said, wait a second, he's going to give the blessing to your brother. You're the one that's supposed to be blessed.
I think the question then is, if she hadn't stepped in, would God keep that promise? I think he still would have figured out a way to do it. I don't know that they had to scheme in order to accomplish this task, but
that shows you the dysfunction of the family, probably. If
That's
you
right.
read in between the lines, whether it's Isaac's refusal, maybe, that to hear this, especially considering the culture of always blessing your eldest, as far as your son is concerned, this would have been very, very different. And sometimes, we don't want to do what God wants us to do in the midst of a culture that's telling, you'd be doing something really, really strange. So, but,
yeah.
But it also sets a precedent for Jacob when he does the blessing. He doesn't bless the eldest, he blesses someone down the line. So
Yeah.
Right.
No, absolutely. All right.
So question then, since you guys put it to me like that, and I hear that blessing now. Question is, who told Rebecca that blessing? And then if it was promised that the eldest should serve the younger, then is she really scheming, or is she kind of actually stepping out on faith? to see if that's fulfilled.
I mean, if you're asking us about their motivation, we don't have enough information to
Right.
know to say one way or the other. I don't think we could concretely say one way or the other. What we can say is what Rich mentioned is the family's dysfunctional and they do some crazy things. Um, so is this part of that dysfunction or is she stepping out of faith? I wouldn't feel comfortable concretely saying either way.
Well, it's interesting that nowhere in the Bible does God rebuke Rebecca or Jacob for what they did. Usually, if
That's
somebody
true.
does something they're not supposed to do, God will rebuke them. But I don't see anywhere where God rebukes Jacob or Rebecca.
Yeah, but
That is
at the same
true.
time, I mean, there's definitely, I mean, I guess this goes back to, you know, you can go to just the law, and then the spirit of the law is whether lying is actually okay to get whatever it is. Does the ends justify the means? And you can talk about Rahab, and you know, God doesn't actually rebuke her either, but was it okay that she lied about the spies? And that's an interesting rabbit trail that goes
Yeah.
somewhere else. But I agree from that standpoint. But I think the overall picture, though, we would have to say lying has never been part of God's plan, in any sense of the way. Now, the way it worked out, of course, it's debatable as to how it would have worked out if they didn't scheme, and we will never get to know that. But I would sit on the side of, yeah, I'm pretty sure she wasn't meant to lie and scheme to get this done from that standpoint.
Yeah.
Also, Jacob gets it back from his father-in-law, Laban, and the trickster that he was, and the labor that he had to go through. And so I think God just allows things to play out and kind of sits back and laughs and still works his own plan. And I think Rebecca said that whatever, put on her whatever curse or whatever horrible thing that would happen to her, just so that her son could get that blessing. So I don't know if God built that or how he built that, but I think that they knew that there was going to be a little bit of pushback eventually.
Yeah.
But you also have to think about God is outside of time. So he knew that everything was going to play out from the beginning, way back when he opened up, when he said, let there be light. He knew that the deception's going to be there. He knew all of this stuff. So, I mean, he's just letting it come out the way his plan is. So his plan is exactly what happened. Now, was it a good thing that she lied and a good thing that he, stole things? Also, Esau's heart was not in the right place because it was more about himself than anything else.
Yeah.
It wasn't, he sold his birthright to his, for a bowl of soup or stew or whatever. I mean,
That's right.
God knew all of this from the beginning. So I think whether it be faith or whatever, but he knew what was going to happen before it happened.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Before we go any further on this, because we can, and we actually kind of will, but we're going to switch to Jacob. So let's go to Hebrews chapter 11, and let's look at the next verse, because this verse is going to focus on Jacob himself, and Jacob is also, part of what's going on here. So Hebrews 11, what are we at? I think verse 21. Yeah. All right. Let's see. Marlon, are you up for reading verse 21?
Yes, that's fine. Hebrews 11, verse 21. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff.
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of really interesting information in this particular verse. So I'm not 100% sure we're going to get all the way through it this week, But I just want to start off by telling you, when I studied for this verse, I'm super conflicted. I'm conflicted about Jacob in general. I'm not 100% sure how I really feel about him. Let me give you just a quick story and example, kind of unrelated, but you'll see how it's related. A long time ago, my wife and I, she was trying to get into some account. I don't remember, like a bank account or some account. And when she called them up to try to get access to it, I had set it up. And so they asked her, you know how this is. They have these security questions, which are generic questions that if it's you, you should know the answers to. And one of the questions, the security questions was, who's your favorite superhero? And so they asked my wife that, and she's supposed to say who my favorite superhero is. And this is in, I don't remember, this is right after Sony had rebooted the Spider-Man movies. And so she replied, Spider-Man. And that's the wrong answer. That is not my favorite superhero. And so she got it wrong. And she came up to me and told me, and I was like, oh man, I feel like you don't even know me if you think Spider-Man is my favorite superhero. And so we talked about it a little bit. Just FYI, Batman is my favorite superhero, not Spider-Man. And so she's asked me why not Spider-Man? And I was like, well, okay, you have to understand my context for Spider-Man. It's these Sony movies and comic strips and comic books and everything. And in my opinion, Spider-Man is a whiny little kid. He's just whiny. He complains a lot, and has so much drama in his life. It's just hard for me. Like, even if you watch the movies, what happens in this reboot? He falls in love with this girl. He's just about to tell her he loves her, or he does tell her he loves her, and then she dies. It's like, come on. And even in the new ones, what happens? He's got this girlfriend. Oh, he loves her, and then he has to change the universe so nobody knows who he is. I'm like, come on. This is just way too much drama for my taste. And so Batman has drama too, yes. But he's not whiny, and that was part of the big part. And so here's why I kind of feel conflicted about Spider-Man. Yeah, yes, he's a kid, he's whiny, he's got a lot of drama, but on the other hand, he's also a superhero, right? He's got superpowers. So he is pretty cool in that sense. So on one sense, I'm like, he's cool, but on the other sense, he's like, he's not going to be up to my favorite. He's not going to be there. So I feel conflicted about him. So if we flip this around to Jacob, this is where I am with Jacob. I'm conflicted about him. Jacob is in Hebrews chapter 11, where God gives him this glory of saying, by faith, Jacob did this. But at the same time, when you look at the life of Jacob, he does a whole lot of things where I'm like, I would not approach things that way. And I'm 100% sure you're not supposed to approach things that way, right? He is, as we mentioned earlier, he's a schemer. He is working angles all over the place. He does this weird thing where with Laban, while he's washing their sheep, where he makes this deal, he can keep the sheep that have spots. So he starts feeding them bark so that the sheep will have spots. And then when they flip things around, he's making changes so that they don't have spots. You know, he's just, like I said, he's always got this angle with him. So on the one hand, there's a lot of examples of Jacob of things not to do. And then on the other hand, he makes it into the Hall of Faith. He's one of the founding fathers of Israel. He is Israel. So I'm conflicted about him. So as we go through this, just keep that in mind. We're going to see some things. The first aspect that we're going to see from Jacob is an example of how not to do things. And then after that, we'll see some example of faith that Jacob has that are good, that are beneficial, that we should copy. All right. So there's my intro to Jacob here. So it says, first of all, it says by faith, Jacob. And we're gonna.
Can I say something real quick?
You bet. You bet.
I like Jacob because that was my life before and after Christ, and really I see that Jacob is a work in progress, and God's working through him all the way through, even to the end when he's when he blesses his son. So for me, I parallel that to my life before I got saved. So I like Jacob. Just saying.
Yeah, no, and that's a 100% reasonable thing to say, right? Just like people would be allowed to have Spider-Man as their favorite superhero, it's legitimate. I'm just saying for myself, I'm conflicted. It's just I'm not relating to it, but I understand why other people would relate to it. Absolutely. So let's let's read. So it starts off by saying, by faith, Jacob. And if you remember, there's this event that happens with Abraham and with Sarah. And when we were going over these verses, we stopped right after it mentioned their name. We're going to do the same thing here because there's this incident that happens with Jacob that is interesting on multiple different levels. And unfortunately, we can't unpack them all. But we're going to look at some of them. So let's jump to Genesis chapter 32. And this is where Jacob wrestles God. So Genesis chapter 32, verse 24. Let's see. Who's up for reading? I've lost track of who's read and who hasn't read. All right, John.
No,
Genesis.
I'm ready.
Genesis chapter 32, verses 24 through 32.
24, 32. And Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh. And the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, Let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. And he said unto him, what is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and has prevailed. And Jacob asked him and said, Tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, Wherefore is that thou dost ask after my name? And he blessed him there. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. And as he passed over Peniel, spoke again, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. Therefore the children of Israel eat not of the sinew which shrank, which is upon the hollow of the thigh, unto this day, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh in the sinew that shrank.
All right, so here's a whole thing, and again, I'm not going to give a whole lot of context to this, just a little bit, which is Jacob is in the middle of another scheme. He's about to run into Esau. He's doing this whole thing where he's going to be on one side of the river, his family's going to be on another side of the river, just in case Esau tries to kill Jacob so that they can escape. He's doing all of this, and he bumps into God, and I have so many questions because his first response is to wrestle him. And I'm just like, I don't understand. I don't even understand that. That would not ever have been my first option or my first thought when I run into somebody is, okay, I'm going to wrestle you now. I'm going to grab a hold of you and not let go until you bless me. But that's apparently the approach that Jacob takes. And he has this wrestling match, and eventually God gets tired of wrestling with him, so he does something to his hip, and so Jacob has to limp away, and he gets this blessing and everything. But there's something interesting that happens here, and this is in verse 28. So in verse 28 it says, And he said, Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. And now let's skip down to the next verse, verse 29. Then Jacob said, and now let's skip down to the next verse, verse 30. So Jacob called. I think this is hilarious because here God has said, you're no longer going to be called Jacob, you're going to be called Israel. And his response is, okay, so call me Jacob. I'm like, okay. And just to contrast this with Abraham and Sarah, which we looked at earlier, God says to Abraham, from now on, to Abram, from now on, you're going to be called Abraham. Everywhere else from then on, he's called Abraham. Even in the New Testament, when they refer to him, they call him Abraham. Even in the New Testament, when they refer to his old life when he's Abram, they call him Abraham. And it's the same thing with Sarah. But with Jacob, it's not. Sometimes he's called Israel, sometimes he's called Jacob. And this is, I think, the first lesson of faith that we can learn from Jacob, which is when God gives us a new identity, what we see with Jacob, God gives him a new identity, and what he's doing is he's holding on to his old identity. He's holding on to this Jacob. He's struggling. He does not want to give up the Jacob part of who he is. And so he doesn't go by Israel all the time. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. And there's a lot of different studies that people have made about all of this, but what we want to catch on to here is he does not give up his old identity. He's holding on to it. And this is our first lesson that we can learn about faith is when God gives us a new identity, don't hold on to your old one. Let it go. Grab onto the new one. Be like Abraham and Sarah, who are like, yes, I'm Abraham. Call me Abraham. Don't be like Jacob, where he says, yes, call me Jacob. I just think this whole thing is hilarious, personally. I don't know what you guys think about it. What do you guys think?
Hey, John, just a quick question. This is kind of off to the sidebar because I had this discussion, I think, within the last week or two. Sorry, my son's driving at a 16-year-old. All right, wait. That when he's fighting with the angel, is that Jesus that he's fighting with?
I'm not.
Who's he fighting with?
I would tend to think yes, and I would tend to think yes because he gets blessed and he's given a new name, and that name literally means, I believe, struggles with God, and so I would believe yes. I don't know how dogmatic you can be about it. He doesn't actually worship him, and that person allows him to. So I don't know if you can say definitively yes or no, but that's where I would lean towards.
Well, verse 30 says that I have seen God face to face. So I would say
He thinks he's seen God for sure.
How special a relationship is that Jacob can assume that he can physically interact with Christ? I mean, we're not given information as to what led up to that. Like you said, John, he meets him and wants to wrestle, but there's no. I mean, if I met any of you on the street and I just embraced you and started wrestling, that'd be kind of weird. So the relationship between this possible Christophany and Jacob, it's at a different level.
And honestly, if you want to look at it from the perspective of he sees God and he just grabs onto God and won't let go, I could totally get behind that, right? If I see God and I want to just grab onto him and not let go, I can totally see that. But this whole situation is weird to me. I don't know what to make of a lot of it. I don't understand that. I don't understand. Jason, I think you wanted to say something.
Can you read for me 24 and the first part of 25 in your translation? Because grammatically, when I read this, I don't read that Jacob latched onto the man. I read the man latched onto Jacob.
Okay.
The man was the one who initiated the wrestling and not Jacob.
Maybe, yeah.
But maybe it's just my
say,
translation.
It does say that, but I'll read it for you. Verse 24,
Okay.
It says, "Then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day."
And then when the man saw that he could not defeat him, that tells me grammatically that it was the man who initiated it, and it was the man who was trying to defeat Jacob, which doesn't make sense because then he dislocated his hip. He was obviously playing coy with him. But I don't see it as Jacob is the one who saw a random man and started wrestling with him. I see that a random man came up to Jacob and started wrestling with him.
But still, there's a personality here that's not mine because he continues to wrestle with him, right? The guy wrestles with him. He's like, okay, I'm pushing back. I agree with what you're saying, Jason.
A random man came up to me in the street and started attacking me. I'm going to defend myself, hold on to him, and not let him go. I mean, that's just what I'm going to do.
Are you going to not let go? I would try to stop him and let him go. I don't know.
You don't know if he has a weapon. You don't want his arms free. You don't want him to let him go until you get help. The moment you let him go, he turns around, and that's just you take it to the ground.
Maybe. I agree it's a possibility. I don't have enough information here to feel comfortably understanding what actually happened here. There's a lot of questions that I have.
I have a second question, because these weren't like this wasn't authored like the New Testament, so it wasn't things that they observed in the character of a person. This was dictated to Moses, so this was God telling when to write Jacob versus when to write Israel. Was this God's decision to do that when dictating to Moses, or was it Jacob's decision to be called Jacob versus Israel? Because like I said, it wasn't like Matthew watching Jesus and he's switching back and forth between Peter and Cephas. This was God dictating to Moses. So how much do you think that plays into the fact and whether or not it was Jacob who didn't assume the name Israel versus God telling Moses to write Jacob versus Israel?
I mean, you make a good point. But my counterpoint would be that in the New Testament they call him Jacob. In Hebrews they call him Jacob, not Israel, which means that's how they knew him. They knew him as Jacob, not as Israel. And if it was me, I would have been, don't ever call me Jacob. I'm Israel. God gave me a new name. Stop calling me Jacob. And people would stop calling me Jacob. So a lot of you probably know this by now, but I actually have changed my name. Every once in a while, it's really rare now because I'm really old. But every once in a while, I run into somebody who knew me as my old name, and they'll call me that, and I'll be like, yeah, but I'm John now. But nobody calls me Lorenzo. Everybody calls me John
Lorenzo, I'm going to now.
because that's my name, and that's how I refer to myself. So so I would just push back a little bit and say, if he really did grab onto this new identity, that's how he would have been known. I
don't know, but they had the written word. They didn't have, so to read it versus having.
I mean, there was an oral tradition too. So they knew who he was as Jacob and as Israel. But Rich, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was going to say, bringing it back to Hebrews 11. I mean, if you're sticking to the context and the text, right, it's calling out a very specific time in which Jacob, in this case, has faith which would emulate. I appreciate the fact that we're studying his life altogether. I'm just not making that connection necessarily. That's
absolutely
the point of faith that
it's not. This is not that point of faith
referring to. And as we're discussing it, we can clearly go back and forth as to, well, did he really have faith at the time or not? But in bringing it back, I think, that point, the faith that the author of Hebrews wants us to understand is at the end of his life, he reaches a point, through all meandering paths that start here and elsewhere.
No, you're right.
Yeah. So, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's actually a reason for this, which is in the last point of this verse, why I wanted to bring up this one. But you make a good point. This is not the point of faith that God is bringing up. This is just, this is an example of why I'm conflicted about him. But this is also an example in Hebrews when it says, by faith, Jacob, that I want to call to attention, because we brought this up with Abraham and Sarah. They got a new identity and they ran with it. But what we see with Jacob is he doesn't seem to run with that new identity. In contrast, when we look at this place of faith that he has, he's actually going to be called Israel, which I think is interesting, that in the passage in Genesis, he's called Israel, but in Hebrews, they call him Jacob. So I think that there's an interesting point here, which is that Jacob has this life that is like what I think. It's conflicting. It's conflicted. He has a lot of moments where we don't see a lot of faith, but at the end, there is. And actually, let's jump to
Hebrews also makes a point that he was leaning on his staff.
You're getting way too far ahead. Yes, you are right, and that's why we brought up this one, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But that's right. Let's if we look at Hebrews again, just real quick, I just want to bring up the point that Rich said, because this is the next point. So the first point that we see here is about faith. is that God gives us a new identity. We need to grab onto it. We need to hold on to this new person that God has made us and not try to hold on to our old lives, our old selves, because we can do that and we do that. And that's not faith. Faith is supposed to be letting that go and holding on to this regenerated new person that we are in Christ. But if we look at the verse in Hebrews, it says, by faith, Jacob, when he was dying. And this is that important part that I think is worth bringing up, which is Jacob's moment of faith that's recorded here in Hebrews happens at the end of his life. This is when he was dying. And there is an important aspect to note here, which is how we finish is what counts. How we end our life is what's important. We can have great moments of faith in the beginning of our life and then turn away from Jesus and decide not to follow him. And those early moments of faith don't count. They're not what we're, I don't know what I want to say. Not that we're graded on, but they don't count. They're not important. It's how we finish our race that's important. And this is a big deal. We have to keep this in mind. It's how we finish. And this is, I don't know what you guys think. We can discuss a little bit if you like this or if you don't like this. I personally like this because this means you can be in rebellion against God for almost your whole life and still you have a chance to repent and turn to him. And you can do that and still, if you put your trust and faith in him at the last moments of your life, you're still saved. That's what counts. And so this is an important aspect, not to get this confused with the idea that, if it doesn't count, then I'm just going to do whatever I want until the end of my life, because that is very risky, one, and it's very wasteful too. It's risky because you don't know when the end of your life is, and it's wasteful because you have a whole life of nothing eternal to show about for it. And so, what do you guys think about this idea of how you end your race is what matters?
Definitely a firm believer, and it's not how you start, it's how you finish. For some of the reasons that you said, I know my students, they want to tell me, oh, well, when I was in third grade, I did this. Yeah, well, when I was a kid, I had a full head of hair. What's that mean now? You know what I mean? It's about how, like you said, you don't know when the end's going to be. And so worst case scenario, if you die tomorrow, what are they going to say about you? Yeah, he was really cool when he was 3. He was very helpful and caring, but the last 30, 40 years, he was a pile. Or, yeah, he was great. He loved God. He loved his family. And generally, people remember the last thing you did, right?
Any other thoughts?
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I didn't start too well, but I'm hoping to finish well. And I think that's the important part is whatever you do it to the best of your ability, the best way you can do it. And that's, really what it comes down to. So
I think also you don't have an excuse at the end, right? In the beginning, you can say, oh, I didn't know. But now you have this experience and this wealth of knowledge to draw from, and you still made those choices. It kind of reflects a little more poorly than having experienced this life. I realized the direction I was going, it was not a good one, and I turned it around and finished on the way up. I think it's a much better way to go out.
So was Jacob's life counted as righteous prior to him becoming Israel?
Here is the thing that is interesting, which is I don't think it matters. I think that when you give your life to Jesus and you are found faithful, and you're covered by what Jesus has done, it covers everything. So then the past is considered, then you're righteous. I don't know what other people think, but I don't know that when God looks at Jacob, does he see him as righteous? Yes. Does that include the past part of him? God sees it all. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what you guys think, but that would be my opinion.
Yeah, I would concur that. I mean, it's not just the sins moving forward. You know, because we have those sins that pop up in our head, and our response to the sins of the past is God has covered that, those mistakes that I've made, etc. I don't think there's a limit to how God can remove sins. He forgets, he removes it. As far as the east is from the west, so I think it's past, present, and future.
You know, and if you look at Jacob's life, he wasn't the greatest father because he caused their division between his family. He picked one of his sons above the other. I mean, all of these things that he did, he wasn't, just as we aren't. You know, we're forgiven for our sins for the past, present, and the future, because we're not perfect beings and we're not gonna do everything completely right. We are still considered sinners, even though we are saved. But God looks at us in a different manner. He looks at the finished product, which is what Jesus did for us. And that's what he's looking at, is that finished product, not the stuff that goes on between.
Good question. All right, I'm looking at the time. Do we have time to go through this next bit? Let's see. 8 minutes. It's going to be tough. Well, let's see. I think I'm going to hold off on this next part because I don't see how we can get through it in 8 minutes. But so we'll finish up this verse next week. I can give you the real quick cliff notes, which is that what we're going to see is that he shows faith in this time when he blesses his son, the sons of Joseph. It's a really cool passage. We'll look through that next week. But we're also going to see that after he does this, he worships. And this is a cool aspect of faith, which is if you put your trust in God, you're going to end up worshiping him because it turns out he's faithful and he's amazing. And then we're going to talk about leaning on his staff, which I think points back to this wrestling match that he had where he's got a limp from now on. And so I wonder if this leaning on the staff is this idea of remembering some of these past experiences he's had with God, and that strengthens his faith. But does anybody have any other thoughts before we finish it up? Because
Yeah.
we saw a little bit of time.
Some was getting to me was just how both Isaac and his father were doing blessings on their deathbed, and how the faith, when you're about to depart of this world, I think there's some kind of understanding that you cannot affect change anymore. And so whatever's going to happen to your family or the people that you care about, it's got to be up to someone else or something else to take care of and watch over. Because I think as fathers, husbands, friends, we feel this certain need as protectors and providers and whatnot. And when it comes down to the end, you kind of understand that, yeah, someone else has to take over. So hopefully I did my job. Hopefully my kids are prepared. And hopefully, God will continue to bless and look after the family while you're gone. So some that stuck out in my head as both of the fathers were doing it on their deathbed.
I find it interesting, and you might get into it next week, is, it was passed from Abraham to Isaac, Isaac to Jacob, and then Jacob to the sons of Joseph. It kind of skipped a generation. And, I'm sure you'll get to that next week. But circling back to the beginning, I like the fact that the Hall of Faith has a bunch of misfits. Because if they were perfect, holy smokes. And so one, it would be disillusional to us. I mean, he doesn't mention it much, but you see Samson down there, and then you see David, an adulterer and a murderer, but also a man after God's own heart. But it's also the point to the fact that the whole thing of Hebrews is a better covenant, a better high priest, a better everything in Jesus. And so to me, it's encouraging to see a bunch of misfits. Rahab's in there, Jacob's in there, Samson's in there, because then that gives me hope. It's not about who I am and what I've done. It's all about the faith that I have in the one.
Yeah.
And so for me, I find it encouraging that these people are there, because if they were all perfect, then I'd be like, nope, no way. Jesus came for the perfect ones. Jesus came for the ones that were already, You know, well, and he says the opposite in the gospel. I came for those who are sick, not the ones who are. So I like the fact that Jacob's in there and others are in there like that as well. So
can I just build off of that just a
Amen.
little bit, which is I think it's not just that they're misfits, because you could say that about pretty much all of them, but also there's different personalities, different types of people that are in here. It's not just that God says, okay, I like these types of people. There's somebody in here that all of us can identify with. And that in itself is pretty cool that there is. I don't necessarily identify super well with Jacob, but there are plenty of other people in here that I totally do. And I like that there's this whole group that God has put in here, so that we can say, hey, if you think your life is more like this person, look, I love that person too. And they ended up being in this hall of faith, which is a pretty incredible thing.
there's pretty much every sin under the sun that's exemplified
In
in all
this
those
group.
people. And just for the sake of equality, there's women in there too. So it's like
Yep.
everybody's there. There's probably not a single person that couldn't identify with one or two of those people there.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
And I think also there's no filter. It's just there. Like, I mean, you go through the Old Testament, there's no filter whatsoever.
Yeah.
We're showing it everywhere and everywhere possible. And I think that's the awesomeness of the Bible, is that he's not trying to hide anything. He's almost trying to shine a light on their failures so that the story, the redemption portion of it just is enhanced that much more.
Yeah.
That's a great point. I love that, because people point to the Bible and say, you know, it's written by a bunch of other people, 44 different authors. How can it be inspired by God? Is if I was writing a story about my family, it wouldn't be about all the sins in my family. It would be about all the good stuff that we did. I wouldn't write a book that had all of these misfits, as we say, in them. So it's a different story that only God could tell, because, hey, I chose these people, but look at them. And we look at the 12 disciples. I mean, there's a whole bunch of misfits in that one.
Mhm. And
Yeah.
to prove your point, Sean, we have that in real time through Facebook. All right, Facebook proves Sean's point.
That's right.
No one puts
That's
the
right.
bad stuff on there. It's all the pretty stuff.
That's
I have an
right.
idea for a new website, Faithbook. So,
Oh,
yeah.